Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a second that, someone offered to just download a master's degree in complex tax law directly into your brain.
Like a sci-fi movie.
Right, exactly. Like while you slept at some luxury spa, no effort, no friction, just pure, seamless acquisition of knowledge. I mean, most of us would probably jump at the chance, right?
Oh, definitely. I know I would.
But the philosophy we're examining today argues that without the grueling, often painful struggle of actually doing the learning, that knowledge would be entirely useless to you. The friction isn't a glitch in the system, it's the entire point.
Yeah, and we've certainly developed this expectation in our modern culture that, I don't know, if learning isn't constantly entertaining or entirely intuitive, then the system is somehow failing the student.
Exactly, and that tension brings us to the focus of today's discussion. We're looking at the worldview presented by the Mentabacus project. It's this highly provocative framework that directly challenges modern educational and societal norms.
It really does go right for the throat of how we live today.
It does. So the central question we're debating today is this. Is the Mentabacus demand for what they call endothermic struggle, boundless astronaut ambition, and radical script-asphemy the necessary antidote to a culture of passive consumption? Or, on the flip side, is it an overly rigid philosophy that misunderstands the practical realities of modern life and the necessity of shared social structures?
It's a profound question, honestly, and very timely.
I'll be arguing that this rigorous, struggle-based approach and the active rebellion against narrative orthodoxy, they're absolutely essential if we want to reclaim our intellectual and cultural agency.
And I will argue that this philosophy relies on false dichotomies, basically. It potentially isolates individuals by dismissing accessible learning and shared societal norms as just mere resignation or, cynicism.
All right, to really understand this, we have to start with the mechanics of how the Mentabacus philosophy views the human mind actually acquiring knowledge. They borrow a term from chemistry, endothermic.
Right, absorbing heat.
Exactly. In chemistry, an endothermic reaction requires the absorption of heat or energy from its environment to proceed. In the context of learning, Mentabacus argues that true cognitive growth must absorb your energy, your time, and your comfort to create a real structural change in the brain.
Which makes sense on a biological level.
Right. Neuroplasticity is expensive. They use this striking, highly relatable example of taking grueling evening classes in tax law. You might sit there on a Tuesday night exhausted, wondering why you're subjecting yourself to it, especially if you never even pursue the field. But the argument is that the pain has a distinct architectural purpose.
It's building the scaffolding.
Yes, it builds discipline, mental structure, and a tolerance for complexity. I mean, Socrates didn't teach his students through gamified rewards and shiny dopamine hits, right? He asked brutally hard questions that made people profoundly uncomfortable. Learning requires you to expend serious caloric and emotional energy to break down old understandings and forge new ones.
See, I come at it from a different way. I certainly don't disagree that neuroplasticity requires effort. Like you said, the brain doesn't build new synaptic pathways for free. It's biologically expensive. But I challenge the binary that Mentabacus sets up here.
What binary?
This idea that it's either grueling, painful struggle or it's meaningless spa day entertainment. I mean, take a look at the actual Mentabacus tool itself, which is central to this whole project. Imagine sitting at a desk with physical, tactile blocks representing verbs, nouns, and grammatical clauses.
Right, the spatial tool.
Exactly. You place them in a spatial grid to physically build a sentence or map out a legal structure. It relies heavily on storytelling, spatial placement, and visual diagrams to make complex systems stick in the mind. They explicitly note that this method makes learning highly complex topics possible for disadvantaged learners who often struggle with purely abstract verbal instruction.
Okay, but how does that contradict the endothermic part?
Well, my question to you is why engineer this highly structured, visual, nearly gamified tool if the overarching philosophy is that we need raw, unmitigated endothermic struggle? By utilizing story, space, and object, they are actively reducing the friction they claim to revere.
That's an interesting point, though I would definitely frame it differently. The existence of that physical, spatial tool doesn't contradict the need for endothermic learning at all. Actually, it facilitates it by providing the right kind of friction.
The right kind?
Yeah, think of the tool as a barbell in a gym. The barbell is highly structured, right? It's a perfect, symmetrical piece of equipment designed explicitly to be gripped safely by human hands. But the structure of the barbell doesn't lift itself.
Right, you still have to do the work.
Exactly. The act of lifting it remains an inherently endothermic, energy-absorbing process that tears muscle fibers so they can rebuild stronger. The Mentabacus tool doesn't remove the struggle. It simply makes the struggle productive rather than futile. It gives them a map and a grip on the weight. But make no mistake, they still have to hike them out and they still have to lift the weight.
I like the barbell analogy. I do. But we have to acknowledge that by creating that map, by utilizing storytelling and spatial placement, they're fundamentally making the process more accessible and, dare I say, more enjoyable.
I don't know if enjoyable is the right word.
Well, humans are wired for narrative. Even in sleep, our minds stage nightly theatrical dramas to cope with the complexity of our waking lives. So when the Mentabacus philosophy dismisses modern educational tools that utilize gamification or narrative as just shiny interfaces catering to passive consumption, it feels a bit hypocritical.
Hypocritical? That's a bit strong.
But they are. They're using the very mechanics of engagement to teach while simultaneously scolding the broader culture for wanting learning to be engaging.
But building that mental muscle using the barbell is exhausting, regardless of how well the barbell is designed. Which naturally begs the question, why would anyone voluntarily subject themselves to that pain if they don't absolutely have to? What drives a person to choose the endothermic path?
Well, that is the million-dollar question.
And Mentabacus answers this with the concept of the inner astronaut. They pose this fascinating hypothetical. What if you knew there would be no financial risk and no social fallout? What would you pursue? What heights would you aim for?
Right, the no consequences dream.
Yeah. And when adults are asked this, they often respond with a polite, self-deprecating smirk. Mentabacus argues that society systematically trains us to quiet our ambition. We disguise this cultural drift toward lowered expectations as smart-sounding realism. But this realism, they argue, is actually just a mask for cynicism and surrender.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That thought experiment, the idea of no financial risk, no social fallout, is a profound luxury.
Is it, though?
It absolutely is. It's completely disconnected from the lived reality of the vast majority of the population. If I am working 2 shifts just to feed my kids and keep the lights on, and someone asks me why I'm not pursuing my wildest astronaut dreams of becoming an avant-garde architect, my polite smirk isn't cynicism. It is actual grounded realism.
But they aren't saying you should literally quit your job.
But demanding that individuals constantly exhibit this boundless courage and put skin in the game, it can be an exhausting, highly exclusionary standard. It implies that if you aren't risking it all to reach some towering, world-changing height, you are succumbing to a cultural drift. I think it completely fails to honor the dignity of ordinary, grounded lives and the very real economic gravity that holds people down.
I see why you think that. And honestly, when I first encountered the astronaut concept, I had a very similar reaction. It can sound elitist if you take it literally, but let me give you a different perspective. The astronaut code isn't a literal demand for everyone to quit their day jobs, abandon their families, and take massive financial gambles.
Okay, then what is it?
Mentabacus defines these traits ambition, vision, courage as internal psychological muscles. It's a metaphor for an internal orientation against fear. It's about not letting the fear of stepping out of your comfort zone dictate your cognitive limits.
So it's more about the mindset than the actual career shift.
Yes, exactly. When they warn against lowering expectations, particularly in education, they point out that reducing the challenge might feel compassionate in the short term, but long term it deprives students of the deeply held belief that they can grow into complexity. The astronaut mindset is about maintaining the internal belief that you can handle the steep hike, regardless of your starting socioeconomic position. It's about not letting the world talk you out of your own capacity.
But if we are genuinely talking about equipping people to handle complexity, we cannot ignore the societal structures surrounding them. The astronaut doesn't launch in a vacuum, right? They launch from a society governed by very strict rules. And that is where this philosophy takes its most radical, and in my view, most precarious turn, the concept of script-asphemy.
Ah, yes, the cultural rebellion. When an individual adopts this astronaut ambition and begins to think rigorously, they inevitably collide with societal norms. Mentabacus describes these norms as scripts.
Like movie scripts?
More like background apps running on your smartphone, draining your battery without you even realizing it. They can be trauma scripts, identity scripts, or broad cultural scripts. Take the cultural script of hustle culture, for example. It's an invisible app running in your brain telling you that if you aren't monetizing your hobby, you're wasting time. Mentabacus argues that many of these scripts are offered in bad faith.
Meaning they pretend to be neutral common sense while quietly reinforcing someone else's control or profit.
Precisely, and that's why Mentabacus defends script-asphemy, the deliberate, conscious act of challenging and breaking these inherited scripts as a moral necessity. Script-asphemy is the act of recognizing that background app and intentionally uninstalling it.
Which sounds great on paper.
But when you do that, when you stop playing along, the custodians of that narrative orthodoxy respond with what is described as the ancient triangle of resistance. They will burn, brand, and ban. They will label the challenger as dangerous, unrealistic, or ungrateful, simply for refusing to read the lines they were handed.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the collateral damage of treating all societal structures as oppressive scripts? Now, I know throwing around names like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida can make this sound like an impenetrable graduate seminar.
I'll try to keep up.
The practical takeaway is highly relevant here. Foucault famously highlighted how societal truth is shaped by power dynamics, and Derrida showed how meaning often lives in what a culture deliberately leaves unsaid. But as even Mentabacus notes, these profound philosophical insights have been flattened in modern debates into a very grim, simplistic story where everything is manipulation and every societal structure is a trap.
Right, the postmodern trap.
Exactly. If we push this idea of scripto-asphemy too far, we fall into that exact same trap. We start seeing enemies everywhere.
How so, though? Can you give me an example of how breaking a bad faith script leads to that trap?
It's about the sequence of maturity. Let's look at Friedrich Nietzsche's 3 metamorphoses of the spirit, which is heavily referenced here. Nietzsche describes the evolution of the human mind in 3 stages: the camel, the lion, and the child.
Right.
It learns the rules. Then the camel transforms into the lion. The lion roars no. It rebels against the dragon of thou shalt. That's the script-asphemy.
Right, the rebellion.
And finally, the lion becomes the child, representing new beginnings, innocence, and the creation of entirely new values.
It's a beautiful progression.
It is. But my critique is that the Mentabacus approach to script-asphemy heavily romanticizes the lion, while completely skipping over the necessity of the camel.
Oh, I see where you're going.
We all know people who are permanently stuck in the lion phase. Think of the professional contrarians on social media. They constantly rebel, complain about the system, and tear down societal norms, but they never actually build anything new because they never put in the work to understand why those systems existed in the first place. You have to bear the weight of the tradition before you can meaningfully critique it. If you just promote constant script-asphemy, you're promoting rebellion without comprehension. You don't get a society of brilliant astronauts, you get chaos.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because Mentabacus specifically warns against that exact flavor of endless cynical deconstruction. They aren't advocating for the Twitter troll version of the lion.
But it opens the door to it.
Well, when they invoke Nietzsche, they emphasize a specific phrase, Umwertung aller Werte, the conscious reevaluation and rebuilding of all values. The goal of script-asphemy isn't nihilism. It is making space for the child phase, the conscious creation of new scripts. Mentabacus is explicitly warning us not to rely on Prêt-à-porte morals.
Off-the-rack morality.
Exactly. Morals and scripts that you just buy off the rack and wear without thinking. If you remain a camel forever, proudly carrying the off-the-rack scripts handed to you by corporations, outdated institutions, or algorithms, you completely abdicate your role as the editor and director of your own life. You are just an actor reading someone else's lines.
The script-asphemy is a necessary clearing of the brush so you can actually build your own house.
Look, I agree that abdicating your agency is a tragedy, but we have to recognize that prêt-à-porte morals, the shared scripts of a culture, are precisely what allow a complex society to function.
But are they functioning well?
Well enough to keep us from descending into anarchy. We don't all have the time, the energy, or the philosophical training to construct bespoke, custom-tailored moral frameworks from scratch every morning. Mentabacus also invokes Carl Jung, noting that we carry universal archetypal patterns, the hero, the orphan, the trickster.
Right, the archetypes.
Jung understood that these inherited narratives aren't just arbitrary limits imposed by bad-faith actors to keep us small. They are enduring, load-bearing walls of human psychology. They are the map. We need the map to navigate living with millions of other people. If everyone is busy committing script-asphemy against every societal norm they find mildly uncomfortable, or, endothermic, we lose the shared narrative that holds our communities together.
But the counter-argument is that the map is currently failing us. The grand institutions that once provided those shared scripts, schools, traditional communities, civic organizations, they no longer speak with one cohesive voice. We're living in a crisis of meaning, where we are drowning in algorithmic content but starving for actual structure.
I won't argue with that.
Right. So Mentabacus isn't saying burn the map just for the fun of watching it burn. They're saying the map is already fading, and in some cases it's deliberately leading you off a cliff, so you must learn the difficult skill of charting your own course. That is why they emphasize that structure still works. They aren't anti-structure, they're anti-autopilot. They want you to consciously choose your structure rather than letting a subconscious mental app dictate your limits.
Okay. I can appreciate that distinction between conscious structure and unconscious autopilot. And perhaps that is where this philosophy finds its practical balance. If we apply the concept of scripts to a smaller, human-scale context, our daily habits, the personal roles we play in our families, the unspoken rules in our immediate relationships, it becomes a highly effective tool for personal agency.
Exactly.
When you zoom out to deconstruct entire cultures, it risks becoming too complex and chaotic. But zooming in allows us to notice what is quietly steering our daily decisions.
Yes, it's about recognizing that you aren't just an extra in a movie someone else is directing. You're the editor. You have access to the cutting room. You choose the shots. You might notice a small park you've walked past for 10 years on your way to work, entirely on autopilot, and suddenly realize the gates are open and you can walk inside. But that realization requires you to stop scrolling, to stop passively consuming, and to endure the endothermic effort of actual self-reflection.
And I will concede that a culture completely devoid of that endothermic effort, a culture that views all difficulty, all friction, as a systemic flaw that needs to be smoothed over with a shiny digital interface, is an incredibly fragile culture. We absolutely need the capacity to sit with complexity, with discomfort, and with ideas that challenge us.
Which is the core of their argument.
Right. My caution simply remains that we shouldn't fetishize the struggle for its own sake, nor should we shame those whose bandwidth for astronaut ambition is entirely consumed by the sheer gravity of their daily realities.
A fair and, I think, deeply human caution. As we wrap up this exchange, it's clear we've touched on the bedrock of how we construct meaning in the modern world. I maintain that the Mentabacus worldview is a necessary, urgent call to action. By embracing endothermic learning, accepting the friction that comes with real intellectual growth, and by aiming high with the courage of an astronaut, we can commit the necessary script-asphemy to escape the traps of bad faith narratives. It is a philosophy of profound, demanding individual empowerment.
And my position remains that while rejecting passive consumption is vital for our survival, we must tread carefully. We cannot romanticize struggle, nor should we casually discard the shared scripts and practical realism that help individuals survive and societies cohere. We need the lion's courage to break bad rules, yes, but we also desperately rely on the camel's endurance to carry the necessary weight of community.
Yet, I think we found significant convergence today. We both agree on the profound insight that learning is not a passing trend and that ultimately, structure still works.
Whether you are currently carrying the heavy weight of tradition like the camel, roaring against a manipulative cultural script like the lion, or creating something entirely new like the child, you must take responsibility for your own mind.
I agree entirely with that. The realization that we are participating in a narrative and that we have the power to step into the editing room and change the script, it's deeply liberating.
It changes the entire paradigm. So we will leave you, our listeners, to reflect on the question that opened this exploration. If you are sitting in the gym of your own mind, looking at the heavy lifting required to truly understand your world, will you reach for the barbell? Or are you still looking for the spa? What's your frequency, and what story is waiting to be lived through you? There is so much more to explore in these concepts, and we encourage you to seek them out, interrogate them, and most importantly, struggle with them for yourselves.